Last year, David Cameron pledged to spend 0.7% of the UK's income on foreign aid, a bold decision for a country still recovering from recession and with homegrown poverty making headlines daily. But putting charity to one side, does foreign aid actually make economic sense for both sides? With me now is Matt Collin from the Centre for Global Development. Well, Matt, foreign aid, why do countries make this a priority? Because it's not just about charity, is it?
There are a number of reasons why a country may choose to give another country aid. One of them might be purely about getting access to resources. So China gives a lot of aid to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily to get access to mineral resources. Another reason why a country might give aid is purely for political reasons, or for diplomacy. So the UK, for example, used aid as a method to get the Rwandan government to withdraw support for the M23 rebellion in eastern Congo a few years ago. They used aid as the primary mechanism to get Kagame to stand down. So there's also evidence that aid buys a country influence on the world stage. So there's a number of studies that show that countries that receive aid from the United States tend to vote alongside it in critical UN General Assembly votes.
I think a lot of criticism is when countries give aid to places like China that seem to be really prospering. And I know as recently as 2013, Japan and America gave aid to China. Why was this?
The amounts of aid going to places like China are rather small. In the case of the US, we're talking about less than, I think, 0.1% of the total US aid budget. So these aren't large amounts, but what you ask highlights a very important debate about whether or not we should be giving aid to poor countries or countries where there are poor people. So despite the fact that places like China and also India are growing quite quickly, actually together they have about half of the world's poor together in those two countries. So if we're worried about targeting poor people as opposed to poor countries, it sometimes might make sense to send money to these places if we think that it can be better targeted in relieving poverty. Of course, there's other reasons why we might want to target places like China. A lot of aid to China helps support climate change policy.
Does America still give aid to China? Because I know China used to be the second biggest economy in the world, but now it's said to even overtake the US, so it does seem sort of bizarre in a way if it's still giving money to it.
Sure, but we shouldn't confuse total economic size with per capita income. And China still holds about a quarter of the world's poorest people.
So who decides on amounts that are given out to countries? Because surely a lot of countries are still suffering with their own economic woes, so shouldn't charity start at home?
It's the government in power. In the US, it's the federal government, and over here it's Cameron's government. But these things have to, of course, be passed by the appropriate legislatures. In case of should charity start at home, I think no, actually. Charity should start where charity is needed the most. We often talk about the postcode lottery in the UK. You know, your access to social services depends on where you live. We tend to categorize countries in the world by their ISO code, and there's actually what we would call an ISO code lottery, in that your life outcomes depend very strongly on about where you're born. The poorest people in the UK tend to do better than a lot of people in a lot of developing countries. So the one exception might be is if we think that that money spent at home is more effective in reducing poverty than it is in reducing poverty in other countries. And that might be the case because we know the context better, because of cultural reasons, we know how to direct aid better in this country.
Well, looking at conditional aid versus unconditional aid now, what are the benefits, the economic benefits for the countries that are giving the aid and receiving the aid?
So when we talk about unconditional aid, we typically think of general budget support, where I give you a lump sum of money and you can choose to do with it whatever you'd like to do. When we talk about conditional aid, we typically think about aid going towards certain projects specifically, or aid towards a certain type of expenditure, such as health or education. If there are economic benefits for the giving country associated with certain projects, then we might think that there are benefits. One example might be the UK gives a good bit of aid to Malawi to support their health sector, and the health sector budget involves training Malawian nurses. A fair share of Malawian nurses make their way to the UK to work in the NHS at the end of the day. This is a benefit to both the UK and Malawi, but it's probably not the reason the UK has chosen to support the health sector in the first place. There's another form of aid which is related to these two called tied aid. Now, tied aid is when a country actually channels that money through companies based in the sending country. So the classic example is whenever the US gives food aid, it buys food off of American producers, off of farmers in the US, and sends it on US-owned ships overseas. This means more money goes through the hands of US citizens. It's politically more popular. It's seen as being terribly inefficient.
So is foreign aid purely a political issue, would you say?
At least in the UK, it doesn't seem that this is purely a political move to, say, adopt 0.7%. This does not make Cameron terribly popular with his own party. And it doesn't necessarily make him any more popular with the average citizen in the UK. Most surveys of people in OECD countries suggest that people tend to already overestimate how much aid is being spent.
So I know a lot of people are concerned about foreign aid because they see the problems that they face back home. In the UK, you have food banks, the NHS is suffering. So economically speaking, do we actually get back more than we put in?
I think the reasons we give aid are less about our own benefit, and if they are, they're more about long-term benefits. So again, I think a large reason we give you aid is because we think that we have a moral justification to fight poverty around the world. But there are also kind of knock-on benefits in the long run which are hard to quantify. Places that are developed tend to be more stable, so giving aid helps in some sense promote global stability. The recent Ebola crisis is a classic example that if health systems in fragile countries are not robust enough, then you can quickly have on your hands an international pandemic.
Well, let's stay with the UK now. And the Independent Commission for Aid Impact says there's only limited evidence that the extra money the UK gave made a real difference in the world's poorest countries. In some cases, it may even have made problems worse. What do you make of this?
This is one of the few countries that actually has an independent body established just to look at our aid expenditure. That's a good thing, and it already highlights that we're more self-critical about our own aid giving than perhaps other countries are.
So overall, do you think it might be wise for governments to be more tactical when they give aid? For example, invest in a country and actually see some returns on the money they're giving out rather than just giving out charity?
So in the short run, we should make sure that aid has substantial welfare impacts for the people that are receiving it. In the long run, we need to think more carefully about whether or not aid is supporting long-term development goals. Should we be more tactical in making sure that, say, UK companies benefit or that we see a direct return? I think these things in the long run tend to be more counterproductive because they tend to undermine that initial development impact of aid.
Well, finally, another concern people have about foreign aid is that it doesn't actually get to the places it should get, and a lot of it's eaten up in corruption and that sort of thing. How much of an issue would you say that is?
I think the days of kind of grand theft of aid are fairly over. I think we're being more critical in how we give aid than we were, say, during the Cold War. So I don't see it as being a major issue today. I think the biggest issues are making sure that aid is effective in terms of the policies being chosen and how they're being implemented.